Jackson Reed almost didn't see the smoke. The county road past the old Krantz farm curved hard through a stand of cottonwoods, and on an ordinary Tuesday, he would have been past the property in 4 seconds without a second look. The morning was cold enough that his breath had already fogged the windshield twice. Ghost didn't give him 4 seconds. The German Shepherd went rigid in the passenger seat, then began clawing at the door before the truck had even finished slowing. A sound Jackson had heard exactly twice before in 2 years, and never once over nothing. Jackson followed his eyes to a thin gray thread rising from a kitchen window at the back of the white farmhouse, barely visible against the morning sky. The kind of smoke that hadn't yet become a fire anyone watching from the road would call an emergency. Ghost was already out the door before Jackson had the truck in park, sprinting across 80 yards of frost-stiff grass toward a window with the curtains drawn, and Jackson was 3 strides behind him when 70 pounds of German Shepherd hit the glass at a dead run and came through it in a shower of broken pane, disappearing into the smoke-filled kitchen without a single second of hesitation. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from tonight in the comments below. If a story like this moves you, stay with us until the very end, because what this Marine found inside that kitchen and what it would take 3 more weeks to fully uncover is the kind of thing that will change how you think about the people quietly checking in on the elderly in your own town. Sergeant Jackson Reed was 36 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders with the kind of compact, functional build the infantry tends to leave behind long after the uniform comes off. He stood 5'11", with dark hair worn slightly longer than regulation allowed now that regulation no longer applied, and a short beard that had gone gray faster on the left side than the right, a fact he had stopped noticing in mirrors years ago. A thin scar ran along his right forearm, the legacy of a vehicle extraction in Marja that he didn't bring up unless someone else did first. His eyes were a dark, steady brown, the kind people described, without quite knowing why, as watchful, the eyes of a man who had spent a decade reading terrain for the thing that didn't belong in it. He was not unfriendly. He simply didn't waste motion or words on anything that hadn't earned them yet. He moved through the world economically, the contained habit of a man who had once needed to clear a room in under 3 seconds and had never fully unlearned the instinct, even on quiet mornings on a county road that hadn't asked anything of him in 2 years. Jackson had served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps, 2 deployments to Helmand Province, and had taken a medical discharge 14 months ago after a vehicle rollover outside Marja left him with permanent nerve damage in his right hand. He had come home to Millers Creek, Iowa, where his grandparents had once farmed 2 sections of land a few miles from the Krantz place, and taken a job with the county's road maintenance crew, mostly because the work was steady and didn't ask him to explain the parts of the last decade he hadn't found words for yet. He drove the same stretch of county road most mornings on his way to the equipment yard, and most mornings, nothing about it asked anything of him beyond paying attention to the frost line and the occasional deer. He had not expected, on an ordinary Tuesday in November, for paying attention to mean the difference between an old woman living and dying alone in a house nobody had checked on in 4 days. Ghost was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, 70 pounds of black and tan muscle that moved with the kind of contained urgency that only ever surfaced when something actually warranted it. His coat ran dark along the spine, lightening to amber at the legs, and a faint scar above his left eye marked a training accident from his 2nd year in the military working dog program. Before a knee injury ended his deployment eligibility, and Jackson fought 8 months of paperwork to bring him home instead of letting him be reassigned. He moved through most days with an easy, watchful calm, conserving the kind of focus he had been trained to spend only when it mattered. He had never once reacted to a sound that turned out to be nothing in the 2 years Jackson had known him. He had reacted to this one before Jackson's brain had even finished processing what the thin gray thread above the farmhouse roofline actually was. The Krantz farm sat on 110 acres outside Millers Creek, Iowa, a white two-story farmhouse and a leaning red barn that had both seen better decades, surrounded by harvested cornfields gone pale and stubbled under the first hard frost of November. The morning was cold enough that breath fogged in front of every word. The sky a flat, colorless gray that made the thin smoke rising from the kitchen window easy to miss and easier still to mistake from the road, for nothing more than a chimney drawing wrong. It was the kind of quiet, isolated property where trouble could sit for days before anyone passing by noticed it at all. Derek Voss was 39 years old and had been approved 14 months earlier as Adeline Krantz's paid-in-home caregiver through the state's Aging and Disability Waiver Program, a Medicaid benefit that paid family caregivers nearly $2,800 a month to provide daily meals, medication management, and basic safety supervision for elderly relatives who wanted to stay in their own homes. Derek was Adeline's late husband's grandnephew, the only relative who lived within 50 miles, and the caseworker who had approved his application had noted, at the time, that he seemed genuinely committed to keeping his great-aunt out of a nursing facility. What the caseworker hadn't seen, because the program's oversight consisted of a single annual home visit and a stack of self-reported timesheets, was that Derek had been visiting Adeline twice a week instead of daily for the better part of a year, signing timesheets for visits he had never made, and using the bulk of the stipend to cover payments on a truck he had financed the same month his application was approved. He had told a friend at the feed store 2 weeks earlier that the old woman barely noticed who came and went anymore, and that the state wasn't exactly checking up on either one of them. Adeline Krantz was 87 years old, a widow of 9 years who had lived on the same 110 acres since marrying Otto Krantz, a Korean War veteran, in 1959. She had outlived 2 sisters, a son who had died young, and most of the friends who used to call to check on her. And she had grown stubborn about staying in the house she and Otto had built their whole life around, certain that leaving it would mean losing the last place that still felt like him. She did not complain about the days Derek didn't come. She had stopped expecting most days to be the kind where someone did. On the morning the space heater in her bedroom shorted against a frayed extension cord Derek had promised 3 separate times to replace, Adeline had been alone in the house for 4 days, her hip too unsteady to manage the stairs quickly enough to reach the kitchen before the smoke from the failing wiring filled it. Jackson followed Ghost through the broken window without a second thought, the smoke thinner than it had looked from the road, but sharp enough to burn the back of his throat. He found Adeline on the kitchen floor near the base of the stairs, unconscious. Her lips faintly blue, one hand still curled around the stair railing she had apparently been trying to reach when she collapsed. Ghost was already pressed against her side, refusing to move even as Jackson knelt and checked for a pulse. It was there, thready but present. Jackson called it in immediately, ambulance and fire both, and got Adeline out the back door into the cold morning air, while Ghost paced a tight circle around them, unwilling to put more than 3 feet of distance between himself and the woman he had broken a window to reach. Jackson kept 2 fingers on her wrist the entire time, counting the gap between breaths the way he had been trained to count gaps in a much louder kind of emergency, and did not let himself think about how close the timing had been until the ambulance was already turning onto the county road. The volunteer fire crew arrived 12 minutes later and found the source of the smoke fast, a space heater in the upstairs bedroom, its cord melted through where it had been pinched under a dresser leg for what looked like months. The fraying visible, even to Jackson's untrained eye. The fire chief, a heavy-set man named Pete Holloway, who had lived in the county his whole life, crouched beside the cord and shook his head slowly. "This has been sparking for a while," he said. "Whoever's supposed to be checking on her should have caught this weeks ago." "Who is supposed to be checking on her?" Jackson asked. Pete didn't know the answer, but the paramedic loading Adeline into the ambulance did. There's a state caregiver program note in her file. "Grandnephew. Derek something." She glanced at the kitchen, at the layer of dust on counters that hadn't been wiped down recently, at a refrigerator holding little more than condiments and a carton of milk 3 weeks past its date. "Doesn't look like he's been doing much checking." Jackson rode along to the hospital, Ghost refusing to leave the ambulance bay until a nurse finally let him sit in the hallway outside Adeline's room. He sat there for 6 hours, through the hospital's attempts to reach Derek Voss, through 3 unanswered calls, until Derek finally walked in just after 4 o'clock with the unhurried ease of a man who had not yet understood how serious the morning had been. "Is she okay?" "I came as soon as I heard," Derek said to the room generally, not quite making eye contact with Jackson or with Ghost, who had gone very still the moment Derek stepped through the door. Jackson stood and introduced himself, and something in his flat, even tone made Derek's easy concern falter slightly. "Where were you?" "I check on her regular. I must have just missed her this week. Things have been busy." Derek's eyes moved toward the hospital bed, toward Adeline still unconscious with an oxygen mask over her face. And back to Jackson. "I don't really see how this is your business. It's my business because I'm the one who pulled her out of a house that's been on fire since before either of us showed up today." Jackson kept his voice level. "When's the last time you actually checked on her? Not signed a form?" "Checked." Derek didn't answer, and the silence answered for him. Jackson called the county's Department of Health and Human Services the next morning and spoke with a caseworker named Sandra Pruitt, who pulled Derek's file within the hour. What she found, cross-referenced against the timesheets he had submitted over the past 14 months, did not match what the hospital staff, the fire chief, and Jackson himself were now independently describing about the state of the house and the state of Adeline's care. "He's been billing for daily visits," Sandra said. 7 days a week, 14 months straight. No gaps. That's roughly $40,000 in stipend payments. If even half of what you're describing is accurate, that's not a paperwork error. That's fraud against a state Medicaid program. And it's also adult neglect. Sandra opened a formal investigation that afternoon, pulling utility records, fuel purchase records from Derek's truck, and statements from 2 neighbors who confirmed they rarely saw his vehicle at the Krantz farm more than once or twice a week. Jackson visited Adeline at the hospital every day that week with Ghost, and by Thursday, when she was finally lucid enough to speak clearly, she told Sandra in a small but steady voice that she hadn't seen Derek in 4 days before the fire, and that it hadn't been the first time. Derek found out about the investigation before Sandra's office formally notified him, through a clerk he knew at the county courthouse, and he drove to the hospital that evening before visiting hours ended. He found Adeline alone, Jackson having stepped out briefly to take a call and pulled a chair close to her bed. "They're saying I haven't been taking care of you," Derek said, his voice low and urgent. "You know that's not true, right? You get confused sometimes, Aunt Addie. The smoke, the fall. It's made things fuzzy. If you tell them you're not sure what happened, this all goes away, and you don't have to worry about ending up in some facility because some stranger with a dog decided to make trouble for our family." Adeline, still weak, still tethered to an IV line, looked at him for a long moment before she spoke. "I know exactly what happened, Derek. I sat in that kitchen for 4 days waiting for someone to come." Jackson stepped back into the doorway in time to hear the last of it, Ghost moving past his legs into the room without being asked, planting himself between Derek's chair and the hospital bed with a low, steady stillness that needed no translation. Derek stood quickly, his composure thinning into something closer to panic. "This isn't what it looks like," he said. "It's exactly what it looks like," Jackson said. "And you need to leave before I call security, instead of just asking you to." Derek left, but the moment cost Adeline something Jackson watched settle over her face after the door closed. The particular exhausted fear of a woman who had just realized the person she had trusted to protect her had instead tried to talk her out of the truth. It happened the following week, in the parking lot of the county courthouse, where Derek had been summoned for a preliminary interview with Sandra Pruitt and the county attorney's elder fraud unit. Jackson had brought Adeline out of the hospital now and staying temporarily with a neighbor to give her formal statement, and the two parties crossed paths near the courthouse steps. Ghost saw Derek before anyone else did. He stopped walking entirely, planted himself between Adeline and the man approaching across the lot, lowered his head, and would not be moved by leash, by command, or by Derek's own attempt to step around him. Derek stopped too, 20 feet away, looking at the dog the way a man looks at a door he has just realized is not going to open for him. Jackson stepped forward, one hand loose on Ghost's lead, and let the moment settle before he spoke. "Sergeant Jackson Reed, United States Marine Corps, 12 years of service." He said it the way he'd state a fact in a briefing. No weight added beyond the truth of it. "I'm telling you that because you should understand exactly what kind of attention this case has already gotten, and exactly how much of it has nothing to do with sympathy for a man who billed the state for care he never gave." "I don't have to talk to you," Derek said. "You don't. You'll talk to them." Jackson nodded toward Sandra Pruitt and a man in a county attorney's office windbreaker crossing the lot toward them. $40,000 in stipend payments for daily visits that two neighbors, a fire chief, and your own great-aunt all say didn't happen. A space heater cord you were told 3 separate times needed replacing. 4 days alone in a house with no working smoke detector and a refrigerator that hadn't been restocked in weeks. "You don't know what my life's been like, trying to manage all of this on top of everything else," Derek said, the words cracking under their own weight even as he said them. "I know exactly what it costs to take care of somebody properly," Jackson said. "I watched Marines do it for each other for nothing, because it was the right thing to do. You took $40,000 to do the opposite for your own family." The county attorney's investigator reached them then, file in hand, and asked Derek to step aside for questioning before the scheduled interview began. Whatever composure Derek had walked in with collapsed at the edges into something closer to panic. "This is insane. I want a lawyer." You'll get one," the investigator said. "Derek Voss, you're being charged with Medicaid fraud and neglect of a dependent adult." The questioning happened inside, away from the small crowd that had gathered on the courthouse steps. But word moved through Miller's Creek fast enough that by the following week, 2 more families in the county had quietly contacted Sandra Pruitt's office about caregivers of their own whose visits, in hindsight, hadn't added up the way the paperwork claimed either. Jackson did not gloat. He stood beside Adeline on the courthouse steps, Ghost between them, and watched the investigator's car pull away with nothing on his face but the particular stillness of a man who had done what needed doing and felt no urge to celebrate the doing of it. By the following spring, Adeline Krantz was back in the farmhouse, the wiring fully replaced through a county home safety grant Sandra Pruitt had helped her apply for, and a properly vetted home health aide visiting 6 days a week under a care plan Sandra personally reviewed every quarter now. The county's Elder Services Office had also added a simple new requirement to every paid family caregiver file in the system: a quarterly in-person verification visit by someone outside the family, a small change Sandra credited entirely to what had happened at the Krantz farm that November. Derek Voss pleaded guilty that February to Medicaid fraud and neglect of a dependent adult, was sentenced to 3 years with a restitution order covering the full $40,000, and was permanently barred from serving as a paid caregiver under any state program. Jackson still drove that stretch of county road most mornings on his way to the equipment yard, and most mornings now he slowed down without needing a reason to, because Adeline had taken to sitting on her front porch with a cup of coffee whenever the weather allowed, and Ghost had taken to bounding across the yard to greet her the moment the truck rolled into the drive. She kept a second mug ready most days, the way people do for company they have come to expect. The window Ghost had broken through that November morning had long since been replaced, but Adeline had kept the old, cracked pane in the barn, propped against a wall, unwilling to throw away the one thing in the house that had announced, louder than anything else ever had, that someone was finally paying attention. Sometimes the danger isn't the fire. Sometimes it's the slow, quiet absence of the people who were supposed to be paying attention long before the fire ever started. Adeline Krantz didn't need a hero to walk into a burning house. She needed someone, anyone, to notice 4 days sooner than anyone actually had. A dog did that, instinctively, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, simply because he was trained to notice what people too often learn to overlook. God does not always send help in the form we expect it. Sometimes, He sends it through a stranger on a county road who happens to be paying attention at the exact moment someone has run out of time to wait any longer. Pay attention to the ones who have gone quiet. It may be the only warning you get. If Adeline's story touched your heart tonight, share it with someone who still checks in on the elderly neighbors and relatives that everyone else has stopped calling. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever noticed something wrong before anyone else did, we would love to hear that story too. And if you believe in stories of service, attentiveness, and the quiet courage it takes to break a window for a stranger, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and give you the kind of instincts that refuse to keep driving past someone who needs you.